What's going on, guys? Brace here. Today we have another topic from some random tactics. We will talk about whether to take the longer charges, whether to give your opponent longer charges, and how to generally handle such things. So this is one of the subjects that are a part of a much larger problem, which is the risk management in the ninth page. This is the crucial part of the game. In this video we'll talk specifically about the charges, but soon I'm planning on a more general video about risk management. I will try to answer two questions in this video. First of all, whether to give your opponent longer charges, and second of all, whether to take the longer charges. So very often you can find an opinion online that you should always try to stay over the maximum charge range just to avoid any kind of risk, just to play very, very safely. And this is fine. But in my opinion, this is fine only in the case where the game is already finished, basically, where you already know that you are going to win, and the only question is how high do you win. And then you should probably avoid any kind of long charges from your opponent, because it gives you unnecessary risk. And usually at that point of the game, you don't want that. But in most of the games, I think that before any important conclusions are reached, it is very important to give your opponent sometimes a longer charge. So what I mean by the longer charge is a charge on 11 swift stride, or a 12 swift stride, or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 without swift stride. Maybe 8 is a bit too risky, maybe from 9 up. The charges on 10 with swift stride and charges on 8, 7 with no swift stride are pretty risky, so it's not that easy to force your opponent not to take it, because basically your goal with giving your opponent longer charge should be to force him not to take the longer charge. So you should always present the stick that will hurt him when he tries to make the charge and fails it. Very often this stick might be really hidden, like if you charge this unit now and you will fail, then you won't do anything this turn, and in the future turns I can just chaff you, and this unit won't do anything till the end of the game. So you have to count that sometimes your opponent won't even realize the danger behind him charging and failing. Basically the easiest stick is just set the counter charges. Because of the failed charge mechanics, he basically will be forced to move forward. And now with the failed charge, you can actually move within half of an inch, and you don't even need to complete the full wheel. So the failed charge states that first you wheel the maximum you can, or if before you reach the direction to the center of the unit that you were charging, then you stop there, and then you move the rest of the distance straight forward. So the only way to stop yourself from failing a charge a long distance is actually having another unit that will block you during the straightforward movement. So it's not that easy to pull off, but obviously it's possible. So for example, if you give your opponent a charge on 11 and he fails it on like 5 inch, he moves forward, then you usually have to threaten him with some charges on the flank, some counter charges from the front, because nowadays I think it's very important who gets to charge. It changes a lot for a lot of units, and the initiative thing is pretty crucial, so there's that. Okay, and maybe let's backtrack a bit and ask, why would you ever give your opponent a chance to charge? Well, the answer is simple. If you stay always over 12 inches, even if you are faster, let's say you have 4 movement more than your opponent. So if he has a charge on 13, you have a charge on a 9. If he backs 2 inches back, then you will have a charge on 11. And this is not an easy charge to make. If, however, you stand closer, for example, on a 9 with no swift side, then you have a charge on a 5. And if he backs up, you have the charge on a 7. It's much better. And if he decides to charge and fails it, you have a charge on even closer. So basically, if you always stay behind the 12 up charge, then very often you will just stand in front of your opponent and you will be backing 1-2 inches and nothing will happen in the game. And if nothing happens in the game, obviously you can win the scenario, you can win some small points, but very, very often it will end in a draw, and we are not looking for draws. So the other question to ask is whether you should take the longer charges. And my answer is generally yes, especially if those charges are semi-free. So you can spend the chaff unit to get rid of any consequences, or if those charges are not that important. So if they are somewhere on the flank or between some small units. Why is that? Because by taking the longer charges, you are sending a message to your opponent that you will take those charges. So he will play more cautiously, he will play more safely, and he will not give you longer charges in more important moments. So he will have a much harder time to push you. If you never take longer charges, then your opponent will be able to push you much easier. And I tend to test my opponents in the first few turns. I tend to give them some longer charges in some places, in some non-important places. And if they don't take it, then I know that my opponent is playing very cautiously and I can push more aggressively, just because they don't like taking the risks, and they will just back off, and I will keep pushing them, and eventually they will crash on the board edge. But if they start taking those charges, I make sure that I can punish it in some way, even in little ways, because 9th Age became a bit of the point of small point games. So, for example, if you get 451 points from your opponent and you get the objective, you already get 15-5. 15-5 is a decent result. So to sum up, I think that the longer charges are a very interesting mechanics of the game, and I tend to both give my opponent longer charges and take the longer charges. I think it makes the game much more dynamic, and I personally like playing dynamic games. Not only because they are more interesting, but also because I feel better when playing them. I feel that I can outplay my opponent in dynamic games. I don't like playing those very positional games where you just score some points from the distance and you win that way. I think that this is my big advantage, that dynamic games where a lot of things are happening, are definitely my games. So I guess that this should mean that you should adjust what I said in this video to your own games, to your own playstyle. And the last thing that I want to mention, which I forgot to mention before, is about combo charges. So let's say you have a big unit that will win against any of the 2 opponent units he has, but cannot win against both of them at the same time. So you can obviously give them like charges on 11 on the Swift. Let's assume they are Swift Stride. So you can obviously give them charges on 11. I would say that you can even give them charges on an 8 Swift Stride, because chances of making the charges, both charges on 8 Swift Stride, are not that great. And there is an additional aspect to that, because actually, when your opponent just fails a single charge and he makes it to, and he doesn't make it to your unit, he can still chaff you and do all this fun stuff. But if he tries 2 charges on an 8 and he fails only 1, then he basically lost a unit and most likely gave you a free reform. And this is extremely dangerous. And you can see in most games, if the big block of your opponent gets a free reform, you have to do some kind of weird magic to prevent him from completely destroying your army, like, I don't know, blocking his reform with some tiny chaff movements so that he cannot basically turn, but it's not always feasible. And I think that many opponents will struggle to take the combo charges, even if they are on the Swift Stride on the rolls of 8. And definitely, if they are on Swift Stride rolls of 9, practically nobody will take two charges on Swift Stride rolls of 9. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Hope you will have fun games with those kind of tactics. And see you in the next one. Cheers.